which is that there is a disconnect between what governments in general are adopting in terms of their positions in the negotiations and what they are doing domestically. In the negotiations, governments tend to be conservative traditionally in terms of what commitments they are prepared to make in the negotiations. But domestically, independent of the negotiations, many governments around the world are doing many, many things which will lead to a positive impact on carbon emissions. If you look at what the United States is doing, they have done quite a lot, in my view, although the United States tends to be the subject of a lot of criticisms by civil society as well as the media, because the Obama administration tried to pass legislation and they did not succeed. The reasons are well known to all of you. But they have, instead of choosing the legislation route, used the regulation route through the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, to really make a difference, in my view. They are increasingly making the use of coal more prohibitive by imposing regulations for new power plants that makes it easier and cost-effective to switch to shale gas. And on top of that, I think you would have heard about the shale gas bonanza in the United States, which is really making a very concrete impact on US emissions. And a recent report on The Economist said that the US has been able to reduce its emissions by about 450 million tons since the gas bonanza began. Likewise, China, again, often the subject of a lot of attention in international negotiations, civil society, and the media. They are the world's largest spender on R&D as far as green technology is concerned. They have overtaken the United States in terms of the amount of money that the Chinese government spends on green technology. And controlling carbon emissions is very much embedded into their 5-year plans. And in typical Chinese way, when they decide to do something, they do it in a very coordinated and determined way. And China is also piloting with market mechanisms or price mechanisms for carbon emissions in 6 to 7 of its provinces. Likewise, India, also experimenting with market mechanisms and carbon pricing with regard to energy efficiency in certain sectors of its economy. The point that I'm making is that if you look at what's happening in the negotiations in itself, it can be quite depressing. But I think it's important to step back and look at what's happening outside the negotiations. What are governments actually doing? And there, I think governments are actually doing a fairly good job. But is that enough? No. I'm certainly not here to defend the actions of other governments. But I think the larger point is that it's important to look at what governments are actually doing domestically. And increasingly, the United Nations negotiations process is one aspect of this broader arena where climate change action is taking place. There are many, many other voluntary initiatives which are taking place where interested countries and cities are getting together to take actions in terms of reducing their emissions, increasing energy efficiency. APEC, which is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, a regional grouping, has set energy intensity targets for APEC members. It's a voluntary target, but it shows you that there is a political willingness to talk about these issues in a regional context. The G20 has been talking about it. OECD has been doing a lot of work about energy efficiency. And cities, you may have heard about the C40, which is an initiative of about 40 cities. Now there are more than 40 cities in this initiative. And increasingly cities are becoming the drivers and the catalysts for sustainable development, because more than 50% of the world's global population lives in an urban context. If you can solve the problem of sustainable development in a city, then I think it's more than half the battle won. And it is in that context that Singapore too is doing a lot of interesting things, but more about that later. The fourth point that I wanted to make is that in spite of your inclinations to believe this, I think the climate change negotiations process has not done too badly. It's clear that we have fallen short of public expectations. Public expectations are very high in terms of what the negotiations should deliver. Public expectations puts pressure on governments around the world to deliver, to go further, to go faster. But there's still a gap in terms of what the public expects governments to do and what governments actually are delivering around the world. But in spite of all that, I think if you look at it dispassionately, what the climate change negotiating process has done, it has done some good things. And let me give you some examples. First, in Cancun and Durban, we have adopted a very comprehensive framework for increasing transparency globally in the actions of governments. This is known in climate change parlance as MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. And the decisions made at Cancun and Durban last year will require all countries, both developed and developing, to submit a report once every 2 years on their inventory, on their actions, and on the emissions reductions that they have achieved. In the past, no such reports were required, especially for developing countries. So in that sense, it is a big step forward for the process, because transparency means being able to explain what you have done and, in a sense, being accountable for your actions at the global level. And I think that's a very important starting point for governments around the world to be able to explain what they are doing and how that is making a difference to the global solution that we are trying to seek. The second very concrete thing that was decided in Cancun and later at Durban is that we have agreed to establish what's called a peer review process. And in the climate change context, this process for developing countries is going to be called as ICA, International Consultations and Analysis. And what this peer review process will do is that each country will have to go to an international meeting in the UN context to explain what it has done. And people will be able to ask questions, seek clarifications, and again, what this will do is bring in more information, create greater transparency, and allow governments to explain what they are doing and how that is contributing to the global solution.